Now we get down to the main speaker, Barbara Boyer, who's going to talk about the Unit 731. Barbara has been for some years a teacher at South Plainfield High School. She just retired this year. She's a summa cum laude graduate of Rider University. She also holds a master's degree in Spanish linguistics from Penn State and a second master's degree from King University. Barbara has a keen interest in Asian history, and as has been mentioned, in the summer of 2012, she was privileged, as I was this last year, to travel to China on a scholarship to study Chinese history by New Jersey Alpha. Focuses on China and Japan during World War II, and Barbara is going to present a lecture on the little-known but profoundly disturbing book by Peter Williams and David Wallace, Unit 731, Japan's Secret Biological Warfare in World War II. Please welcome Barbara Boyer.
Yes, very good, thank you. Okay, I want to thank John for inviting me to speak tonight. This is the third time that I was scheduled to address the World War II Book Club. The first time was the storm that followed Hurricane Sandy. And of course, we were all nervous and concerned. We hadn't paid a lot of attention to Sandy, at least I didn't, until my electricity went out for 11 days. So that evening was canceled. The second time that I was scheduled to address this group was the day of a snowstorm in February 2014. And John said that people come from far. Some of you come from far, to the lectures. So it was in everyone's best interest to cancel. So I guess the third time is the charm, because here I am tonight and the weather is fine. Okay. So I am honored to speak to you this evening. The first thing that I want to tell you is that I am not an author, I am a teacher. And initially I was surprised when John invited me because so many of your guests are so distinguished and they're published. But I, as everyone has mentioned, was honored to receive a scholarship from New Jersey Alpha in the summer of 2012. And the purpose is to teach the West, the western part of the globe, about the atrocities committed by the Japanese Imperial Army against China and other Asian countries during World War II. Our education as Americans often is based on Hitler's campaigns in Europe and his mission to exterminate the Jews, along with Japan's bombing of Pearl Harbor. So New Jersey Alpha sponsors teachers to travel to China and South Korea, and my group was very lucky. I got to go to Hong Kong to learn about Japan's attempt to gain control of Asia during the 1930s. My presentation tonight will be divided into two sections. John's going to be my timekeeper. After 45 minutes, John, you wave and tell me that it's time to wrap up. So I'm first going to give a PowerPoint presentation about what I saw and learned about Unit 731, and then I'll give some specific remarks about the book that I brought with me. This is Unit 731, Japan's Secret Biological Warfare in World War II by Peter Williams and David Wallace. Okay, just to give you a little bit of background about myself, my career has been based on language learning. I was an undergrad Spanish major at Rider University. Today, many college students have an opportunity to go abroad to study. But back then, it was basically the language learners who needed to be immersed in foreign language. So I was very fortunate. I had the opportunity to spend a year in Madrid, Spain. And that was probably the most valuable of my foreign language education years. And I want to bring this to your attention because I firmly believe and have personally experienced that seeing firsthand is the key to learning, and that never forgetting something is based on your experience of having seen it with your own eyes. So when I was in Spain, I started to take a key interest in history because I actually had the opportunity to climb the stairs that Columbus climbed when he went to petition money from Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. I personally experienced, Francisco Franco was still alive when I was there. I experienced him driving by in a motorcade in a car that Hitler had given him as a gift. I will never forget these experiences as long as I live. So the experiences that I had by having the opportunity to go to China and to study the atrocities were very humbling. And I will never forget having seen, read about, and witnessed the atrocities in China. Okay, so I'm going to start by calling attention to the title of my presentation. Notice that the Japanese called Unit 731 the Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Unit, which was the secret of secrets. It was an obvious lie because Unit 731 was almost like a college complex consisting of many buildings, which I'll describe to you later, and the purpose was to manufacture biological and chemical agents to kill people. So the first, ironic part about Unit 731 is what the Japanese called it. Okay, this was a presentation that I did. As Don told you, we had presentations at Brookdale Community College and Lincroft. So for the people, and thank you for coming, the people from New Jersey Alpha, this is a repeat performance. Okay, as a teacher, I always like to start with objectives. Here's what I want you, my audience, to know about Unit 731. What happened? What was it? What was this all about? Who did it? And how can we prevent this from happening again? This is a picture of the one building that remains. As I'll show you later in the presentation, I have a slide that shows you all the different buildings around Unit 731. This was the administration building. As soon as the Japanese were defeated, they destroyed all the other buildings. And this is the one that was, I guess, so well made that they couldn't bomb it. So this was the site of the first use of scientifically organized germ warfare. Okay, why did the Japanese create Unit 731? Well, they wanted to demoralize China, first of all. They wanted to depopulate China because they thought that the Chinese were an inferior race. They wanted to have Japan's military superiority established. I'll tell you later about all the experiments, the human experiments that were done. They wanted to conquer northern China and Siberia. And the ironic part about Unit 731 is that it's the opposite of actual medical principles. Doctors take the Hippocratic Oath to heal and to save people. And these doctors, who were Japanese military stationed at Unit 731, were there to find ways to kill. Okay, I read that Unit 731 had better labs than the ones that were actually in Tokyo. All right, this is a slide of a picture that I took at the museum. These are wax figures. The man with the important hat, of course, is Shiro Ishii. He was the mastermind behind Unit 731. Now, he was a brilliant man, well-educated. He had an MD in microbiology. He had a PhD. He was a very ambitious man. He rose very quickly up through the military ranks. He was a member of an upper-class Japanese family, and he was a social climber. He was always looking to better his position socially and militarily, so he married the daughter of a university president. He did everything that he could to promote himself. He was very pushy, as I said. He made sure that he had military friends in high places. He was very flamboyant, and one of his famous actions that I read about was that he developed a machine to filter urine. So in front of an audience, he took his own urine, filtered it through the machine, and drank it. He was so persuasive. He was the one who was the mastermind behind the biological warfare. He was narcissistic. He was a womanizer. He loved to go to parties, which is not like many Japanese. I understand that he had a commanding stature. He He demanded authority, and he had a very commanding voice. But he was actually a mad scientist, and he was called in the book a highly functioning sociopath. Okay, Hiro Ishii was the mastermind at Unit 731, but he also had two brothers, which he got involved. One of them, Takeo, was head of security for prisoners, which I'll talk about, and the other one, Mitsuo, was head of animal breeding facilities, which I'll show you in one of the slides. Okay, in 1948, he brokered a deal for immunity from prosecution for war crimes, and I'll talk a little bit about more later. He died of throat cancer at age 67 in 1959, and what he really did was he made a deal with the devil. He agreed to hand over all his information, all the results of the experiments, in order to be immune from prosecution. And that was with the knowledge of General MacArthur and the United States. Okay, who went to Unit 731 while it was operating? Well, it was a center for university professors, medical researchers, and doctors in training. And anyone who wanted to learn about how to kill the enemy with either biological or chemical weapons came, observed, participated. Okay, as I said before, it was called a water filtration and vaccine study, but what they actually did was manufacture the pathogens which were used to kill the people. Okay, the picture that I showed you before, the front of the building, and you'll see it again in a few minutes, what looks like an unassuming rectangular building, but we were not allowed to go underground, but there are underground tunnels that were not visible. Okay, and what the Japanese would do was they would send vans into the city of Harbin, which I'll show you on the map in a few minutes, with no windows, or sealed train cars on secret tracks, and go pick up innocent people, accuse them of being spies, bring them back to Unit 731, and use them for human experimentation. So it was known as a lumber mill, and the prisoners who were kept there and who died as a result of the experiments were called logs. A lot of Chinese were called in to do work to construct the buildings, and they were forced to wear baskets over their heads so they couldn't see anything. So everything was a big secret. The actual building, which I showed you before, is in a little town called Pingfang, and it's 14 miles southwest of the big city of Harbin. Harbin is a beautiful place. It had a lot of Chinese, and it also had a lot of Russians because it was not far from Russia. And Harbin, during World War II, probably was like the Paris of China. It had a lot of immigrants. There were many accessible victims there. They could go into town, pick up anybody that they wanted, accuse them of some kind of crime or treason, sneak them away, hide them in the van or hide them in the train, take them back to the Unit 731, perform experiments. Everyone died who was a prisoner there. Okay, the Japanese were so sneaky in the fact that they would wear Chinese clothing, go out into the countryside around Unit 731, spread biological agents to kill people. And again, the spies, people that they picked up off the street in downtown Harbin, were the human experiments. They wanted bodies for research. They also got prisoners by putting ads in the newspaper for job opportunities. The people would show up. They would be arrested, they would be imprisoned, and eventually murdered. Okay, there was no unauthorized person who was admitted to Unit 731. You had to have a reason to be there or you didn't get in. All right, it had a no-fly zone, so no one could fly above and figure out or try to figure out what they were doing inside. Humans were treated like lab animals, and the exact number of prisoners is unknown because the Japanese had a secret numbering system. So they would start at 101, they would go to 500, then they would go back to 101 again. But they kept very accurate records because they kept people's names, I believe, what their ages were. They wanted healthy, young people to experiment on. Okay, what they would do is they would take healthy people and shoot them. They would take healthy people, innocent victims, and do amputations for no reason. And this was to teach and practice surgical techniques because all these medical students were there learning and doctors were practicing. And I read the testimony of one doctor who, they would do human vivisections. It's like doing an autopsy on a live person. Mm-hmm. And they used no anesthesia because that would skew the test results. Oh, wow. So I read one testimony of a doctor who said the first time that he did an amputation on an innocent person, open them up and examine their internal organs, he was scared and he wasn't sure that this was the right thing to do. He followed orders. By the third time that he did it, it was common, it was normal, and he had no reservations whatsoever. Now, the victims at Unit 731 included Chinese, as I said, Russians, because they were close to the border of Russia. They did experimentation on Koreans, Europeans, and I read that they also did some Americans. I don't know specifically which Americans were killed at Unit 731. I know that there were other prisoners of war in other units throughout China.
Some of the Balkan death march prisoners were actually shipped here.
To Unit 731. Okay, there were 17 other units, so this wasn't the only place, where the prisoners were being killed. And the total estimates of those killed is about 2 million. Now, what they did was they sent biological agents out into the towns. So some flare-ups of these diseases still actually happen today. Okay, this is a picture that I took of an instrument. It was taken behind the glass at the museum. This is a saw, and it was used to saw, the patients, the prisoners, to experiment. Okay, why did Japan use biological warfare? Why were they so interested in doing all this research there? It's secret. It's inexpensive. You kill a lot of people with a little bit. It's very effective for increasing casualties. Biological warfare is invisible, so they could do it and deny it. It was untraceable. It was silent. They didn't need any ammunition. They thought that they wanted to compete with other nations who were also, thinking about using biological warfare, and they could deny it. They could say that it was a natural outbreak of anthrax, for example. That was one of the things that they grew, anthrax. Okay, why did they establish Unit 731 outside of Harbin? It had a large population. There were lots of human beings that could be arrested and experimented on. It had many immigrants. Anyone that they needed for an experiment was labeled a spy, so that Unit 731 was there to carry out the death sentence. Harbin, the city of Harbin, is extremely cold in winter. They did frostbite experiments, and it's hot in summer. But when I was in China, Harbin was I was there, and China was like a furnace in the summer. But Harbin was the most pleasant. I felt like a bit of fresh air when we were in Harbin. Okay, here is a map. Here is Harbin, where the circle is. The yellow is Russia, so you can see how close it is. Okay, on my trip, I went early with a friend of mine. This was not included in my trip, but I did go to Beijing. There's the capital. I also went to Xi'an because I wanted to see the terracotta warriors. All right. Our trip started out in Shanghai. Here. We went to Nanjing. Here. Then we went to Harbin. Here. I was fortunate enough to go to Seoul, South Korea, where we saw presentations and a protest in front of the Japanese embassy by the comfort women who are still alive. And also, I was fortunate enough to go to Hong Kong, and we went to museums for coastal defense against the Japanese. Okay, lab workers. Japanese lab workers. What were their conditions like? They wore first of all, they did round-the-clock production. And Shiro Ishii was semi-crazy. He would call meetings in the middle of the night. But the factory that produced the biological and chemical weapons did 24/7. Okay, I'll show you a picture later of layers of protective impermeable clothing that the Japanese lab workers wore. They had to communicate by hand signals. I'll read a quote from the book about the stench that the chemicals made. They produced infectious agents which had to be bottled, stored, and then distributed. Okay. Unit 731 was a big complex. It was like its own little village. They had for the Japanese workers. They had a movie theater, a pool, a school, library, athletic fields, an auditorium, a bar, an airfield, and I'll show you pictures of the power plant. The ruins of the power plant are still there. Okay, there were at least 3,000 personnel scheduled at Unit 731, which included 600 researchers, okay, 600, most of them MDs. Okay, this is a model of the complex. This square right here is the only building that remains. I guess either it was too hard to destroy, it was too well made, or they didn't get a chance to destroy it. But you'll notice that it's like a college complex with all these buildings. All of this was all part of Unit 731. Everything was destroyed before the Allies could go and get the evidence of what they had been doing. Okay, this is a picture that I took. This is just basically a wall. It's ruins of the power plant. You can see the stacks in the background. Okay, there were Chinese laborers who built all these things and were brutalized by the Japanese. The laborers were forced to work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. They got less than minimum wage, I am sure. They were beaten and they were killed for looking. The Japanese didn't want the Chinese laborers to see what was going on, just in case, someone might repeat it to another person. Thousands of laborers were employed for the construction and maintenance of 76 buildings, which I showed you on the previous slide. Okay, there's a laborer's graveyard there because 1/3 of all the Chinese laborers died of mistreatment. Okay, the prison was inside of the administration building, which I got to go into. There was number 7 block for men and number 8 block for men, women, and children. Now, the cells were built to hide prisoners from each other. I'll show you a picture of the bombed out ruins later. They were soundproofed by 1 foot of concrete. And the Japanese wanted experimentation on humans who were in pretty good condition. So they looked for basically younger people between ages 20 and 40. They wanted healthy people to do the experiments on. And they provided heat, air conditioning, blankets, balanced meals, and exercise while they were experimenting on these people. Okay, these study subjects were often given poisoned food, a drink. I read that there was an opening in the door where the person could stick out their arm, just big enough, a little square, like a little window, big enough to stick out your arm so that the Japanese doctors could draw blood or give injections without having to take the prisoner out of the cell. Okay, and many of them were handcuffed or shackled to prevent uprisings. They couldn't communicate with each other. Okay, now this is a picture of a ruin of a prison block, and right here, I believe these are the walls. Now this was destroyed by the Japanese. By the Allies. This is what's left. So these look like individual prison blocks to me. I asked our guide, what are all these buildings in the background? These look like apartment buildings. And he said yes, that the government built these probably in the 70s, or so, and they were, because I said to them, isn't this sad for these people to live in the complex where Unit 731 was? So he told me that the Chinese government is now trying to find housing to move these people out, so that the entire complex will someday be part of the museum. Because the area of Unit 731 goes way back behind these apartment buildings. Okay, no prisoners survived the experimentation. No one survived. Their life expectancy was at the most several weeks. Some of them survived several months. Survivors were lethally injected if they survived the experiment that they were serving for. 20,000 were killed in this human experiment prison, and the prison, as I said before, was destroyed after Hiroshima was bombed, because they didn't want the Allies finding any of their information, or they didn't want to own up to the fact of what they were doing. Okay, so research was conducted on these prisoners to determine which was the most effective method of transmission, which was the best way to kill people. The incubation time, how much time would it take for the population to die? Was the biological or chemical weapon lethal, or did it just incapacitate people? And which was the best delivery method? So what they would do would be they would put pathogens in water and food, and they would put it in the food and distribute it to the villagers. They would use buns. A bun is like a roll, as common in the Chinese diet. They would even put pathogens in chocolate and vegetables. They infected rats with fleas that contained pathogens. They distributed free fountain pens and walking sticks to people, again, in order to spread pathogens to kill the villagers. And so they were doing research to determine what the dose amount should be, which was the most effective dose. Okay, they had production of the most dangerous strains of pathogens. They did this, when people got sick, they blamed natural occurrence. They also developed an airplane which was filled with porcelain bombs. The porcelain bomb, of course, would disintegrate. There was no proof that a bomb was even dropped from the airplane, which were full of pathogens. Okay, how much did they make? Monthly, at Unit 731, they manufactured 600 pounds of plague. Now, I'm presuming, I'm not a medical doctor, I'm presuming that you don't need very much of an infectious agent like plague to get sick. 600 pounds a month. 1,100 pounds of anthrax, 1 ton of dysentery, 1 ton of cholera, and I could not find the statistics for tetanus and typhoid, but I'm sure a lot. Okay, I also saw, which I'll show you a picture of in a few minutes, the frostbite lab. Because they were so close to Russia and the temperature, of course, is very cold, they wanted to do research to find out, how much cold and how much could people stand before they would lose their limbs. So they would make the prisoners go around in bare feet. They would dip their hands into buckets of water. They would put fans on the freezing limbs so that they would freeze faster. They did experiments to see how long and what it would need to take to get people infected with gangrene. Then they amputated affected limbs to see what that would do. And they had used this they had a lab building so that they could control the temperature and do these frostbite experiments year-round. Okay, here is a picture of the frostbite lab. Of course, it's just, an outer shell right now, but this is what's left. Okay, they paid Chinese villagers to catch rats and told them that they were going to use the rat fur to make hats. What they really were doing was breeding fleas. So they caught 3 million rats, infected them with whatever pathogen they wanted to spread, and released them. And I also read that in the book that they used dogs to spread cholera. Now, here is a picture of the small animal cages in the animal breeding program. Now, when I think of an animal cage, I think of something flat with a cover on the top, with some kind of a screen on the top. But their cages were the opposite. They were indentations in concrete, and you can see here the screens. Here's another screen, here's another screen. So they would put the rats in here, put the cover on the top. And these are in a building that is still there. Okay, why did the Japanese want to do all this terrible human experimentation? Well, they thought that it was faster and easier and more effective than to do animal clinical trials, because then they would know exactly what the experiments would do to human beings. They gave no one anesthesia because they thought that that might interfere with the study results. As I said, they wanted healthy people. They wanted young people, 20 to 40-year-olds. So each prisoner was assigned a numbered card with his name, age, birthplace, and the reason, quote unquote, for his arrest. Research was published claiming that the research subjects were monkeys. Yet the scientific community knew that that was impossible because they talked about the body temperatures that the humans had, not monkeys. Okay, this is another picture that I took in the museum. As you can see, these are the doctors. They're covered with their lab coats. They have gloves on. They have face masks and a hat. And this is one of the victims. And you can see the syringe. He's injecting something into that person's arm. Okay, prisoners at Unit 731. They had room for 200 inmates at a time. No one ever survived. It was impossible for them to escape. I read in the book that, that people would moan and scream, and they were in such agony. It really made me sick to even think about what the Japanese were doing to human prisoners. Okay, they were doing live vivisections while strapped to tables. That's like doing an autopsy on a living person with no anesthesia. Okay, and many of the bodies were bloated or emaciated. Okay, they did biological experiments with rotting limbs. There were agents that they would put on the skin and see how the flesh rotted, whether it went to the bone, or whether it was effective, whether this would be good in warfare. And there were all these open wounds on the prisoners. Okay, they did experiments with the fevers and with the frostbite, which I talked to you about. They did repeated blood withdrawals by sticking their arm out of a little window in the door, so that some of the experiments were humans who were actually dehydrated. No anesthetics. They starved people. Sometimes they just gave them water and biscuits. They had pressure chamber tests. They sent preserved body parts to Tokyo. And they did all kinds of so inhuman things to people for no reason. They would cut off people's hands and reattach them to the opposite arms. That was absolutely sickening. They hung people upside down to time them how long it would take them to choke to death. I read in the book they boiled people alive, and they injected people with horse blood to poison them. Okay, they went into the field to do field testing. What they would do is they would tie people up in a circular area and drop a bomb. And they would see what the results were. Some people in the front would obviously be killed first, and then as they went further back, they wanted to see exactly what it did to the human body. They dropped pathogens in wheat, corn, and cotton from airplanes. They released animals with pathogens in unsuspecting villages. And they had balloons and ceramic bombs that they sent up. The pathogens were inside, they hit the ground. The villagers got sick and died. Okay, they told the people they were giving the children vaccines. What they were actually doing was giving them infectious agents, and this is to kill the kids. They sent soldiers out into the countryside with good and bad food. So the soldiers that were eating with the people, they knew what was okay to eat. They ate the good food. The poisoned food was given to the villagers, so they would see how many and how long it took for them to die. Now, 1,600 Japanese soldiers were killed from their own biological pathogens, so this system was not fail-safe. They didn't take proper precautions, and they lost their own people. Okay, they had a toxic chemical lab. They had a chamber that looked like a phone booth with reinforced glass, and they would insert gas, either hydrogen cyanide, acetone cyanide, or potassium cyanide, and they would see how long it took people to die. And then they did autopsies. Destruction of Unit 731. Okay, they killed and incinerated all the prisoners so that there would be, or flew the body parts to Tokyo so that there would be no proof. When the Allies came in, the specimens and the chemicals were dumped into rivers. They wanted to get rid of all the evidence. They torched or exploded the buildings, as I said. They got rid of the living quarters, the equipment, as many materials and documents as they could. And they even gave the Unit 731 doctors poison vials in case they were captured. They were supposed to commit suicide. Okay, here are the questions that I ask today's students when I present this information and do a presentation. We talk about the Hippocratic Oath, and as I said before, when you're a doctor, you take an oath to heal people, not to kill people. These doctors were trained to kill people. Okay, how can medical research today be monitored? How can we prevent this? I asked them to compare and contrast the Nazi forces to the Japanese Imperial Army. I asked them why the Holocaust to our American kids is so well known and Japanese atrocities are so little known. Okay, here is a picture that we took with one of the survivors. This is me. This is the survivor. All these are students that were with me on the trip. We are looking at pictures of this man's body parts. This man is a construction worker. They were digging to build a parking complex, and the chemicals are still there. They're still buried under the ground. So construction workers are doing their job, and they're getting this kind of a wound. He showed us his wounds, took down his pants. So the Unit 731 was the gift that keeps giving. Even today, there are people who are suffering from what the Japanese did in the late 1930s and early 1940s. And children playing outside in the field sometimes come across chemicals and are maimed and or killed. Okay, here's a picture from a book that I read. It's not this one, it's another one. But this man is a victim of biological warfare. He was 14 at the time, he's now 78. But I don't know whether you can see it clearly in the picture, but look at his leg. He still has open wounds for the majority of his life. Okay, this is what we want to know when we teach the kids about the atrocities of the Japanese Imperial Army. Many Japanese deny that this happens. You will not find anything about Unit 731 in Japanese historical textbooks. So we want to know, why doesn't Japan admit to what it did? We have proof. We have researchers who have the information. Okay, why won't Japan apologize for what it did? And how can we make sure that such atrocities like Unit 731 never happen again? We try and get the kids to reflect, to think about it, and to really come up with, hopefully, some answers, because they're the generation of the future. Okay, this is a quote by Peter Lee. Peter Lee is an author. I also have his book. I did not bring all these books with me. I only brought the one that I addressed in the presentation. But he was a professor at Rutgers. He has since moved on to California. But this is about educating those that don't know about the atrocities that are performed by the Japanese Imperial Army. And he says, the post-war generation has not been educated accurately about Japan's wartime role and has come to perceive Japan primarily as a victim of the Pacific War, not a perpetrator. And we know from this research that I have that Japan was certainly a perpetrator. Okay, this is my study group when we were at Unit 731. This is me. This is another teacher from New Jersey. Her name is Barbara also. Here's another teacher from New Jersey. Her name is Sharon. We were the 3 New Jersey participants from New Jersey Alpha. All the rest of the group are Canadians. Everyone was a Canadian except for the 3 of us. And we went to a university, and there was a great big sign that said, "Welcome Canadians." And we wanted to add on, and 3 people from New Jersey. Okay, this is the bibliography that I always like to include. I want you to know where I got my information from. Daniel Barenblatt, I met at a New Jersey Alpha presentation. He's a well-known art author. There's a show called Dateline that actually featured Unit 731 in 1995. I had not seen the show. I knew nothing about it, but it seems strange to me that it isn't more well known in Western historical things.
You can go to YouTube and find it.
Well, that's another. There's my history. I'll get to that in a second. Okay. Hal Gold is another famous author, Unit 731 Testimony. Sheldon Harris wrote a book called Factories of Death. And here we go. Don just said go to YouTube. This was the History Channel YouTube, which has information on Unit 731. Peter Lee, I met him right through New Jersey Alpha, and he published a book called Japanese... Oh, I'm sorry, what did I do? Can we go back? I must have turned it off. I hit the wrong button. If I go backwards, will it come on again? Oh, thank you, John.
Nothing to it.
Okay. Peter Lee is an author. I met him at a New Jersey Alpha dinner. This is a picture book, Blood Weeping Accusations, Records of Anthrax Victims. It's very gruesome to look at the pictures. And the last one on the bibliography is the book that I brought tonight. This is Unit 731. This is the book. I have it here if anyone would like to take a look at it before I leave. It was written by 2 British journalists. Their pictures are on the inside flap of the dust cover. They were television producers who were trying to do some documentaries on biological and chemical warfare. And they did so much research that they decided to gather all their information and print it in a book. This book was published in 1989. It's not new information. So I just want to read one quote from the book. It'll just take me a second. The deadly harvest of the plague bacteria would be ready for reaping in only 2 days. By then, it was a milky white slurry lying on top of the gelatin base. This had to be carefully skimmed off, put in bottles, and then trucked to the bacteria store. The culture base would be sent back to giant boilers for sterilization and recycling. It was this recycling process that caused Ping Fang's distinctive stench. The production line could be used for mass production of many types of bacteria. Production cycles would sometimes last for weeks and months. The line never ceased. So again, if you have any interest in this book, it's got pictures of Shiro Ishii. And what drew my attention in the pictures, these are pictures of all scientists which were stationed at Unit 731. And some documents, some prisoners. Now this was at Mukden POW camp, if you're familiar with that. And then this is the last picture in 1946 of him, of Shiro Ishii in military uniform. So it's a wonderful book. It's just filled with information, with historical facts, and it's gruesome, but it's necessary to know. We have to teach our next generation what the Japanese actually did in China and the other atrocities that they committed throughout Asia.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you.
What about the punishment for all of these crimes? Why were these Japanese never punished?
Well, first of all, they say that they were following orders. And when the Allies came in, they made a deal. And they said, okay, you give us all your experimentation, because they were carefully documented, that's why we know what they did. Give us everything, we guarantee you not to persecute you. And it was like the United States making a deal with the devil. That's what it really was.
And there were some other reasons too, because it was the beginning of the Cold War, and Japan appeared to be on the side of the democracy, primarily because of what MacArthur had done over there. And Japan then appeared to be an ally. And at that point in time, our enemy appeared to be China and the communists. And in order to help Japan build them up and gear up against China, we sacrificed all of the integrity that we should have had to prosecute these war criminals, such as we did in Germany. We just didn't do it in Japan, and we're reaping the benefit now. Namely, that in the Japanese society, there's very little recognition that they've had any wrongdoing. That's the main reason that Alpha has been in existence, and that's one of the reasons this program is here tonight, so that we can reach more Westerners, because we don't have to reach the Chinese people. They know about these things. We have to reach the Westerners to convince the Japanese that they must come to terms with this and apologize for what we're wrongdoing. And teach the children in Japan what has been done by their countrymen. Anybody has some questions for Barbara? Yes, you have a couple. Go ahead, Barbara.
Okay, yes.
Well, the most important aspect, as a disabled combat veteran, you didn't mention at all, how did it affect Americans fighting the war in the Pacific? What was this idea all about? To do what?
The Japanese were trying to find ways to kill the Chinese.
But it didn't affect American troops
Well,
at
there
all?
were American POWs because there were 17 units. I don't believe that many Americans, maybe Don, you know, I don't think there were many Americans that were captured and taken to Unit 731. They were taken to Mukden, right?
There were some, but I don't know the number. So as I said earlier, some of the back-time death march prisoners from the Philippines actually were brought to.
Okay, question in the back?
Hi. I think the reason they were developing it, they did experiment on some Americans. I believe they were pilots who were shot down. But the other thing was they were planning to use rats infested with fleas, I think with bubonic plague,
Yes.
to let them off on the islands where the B-29s was raids came from. And that would have raised holy hell.
Agree with that?
Yes. Yes.
I'm curious, did your research show any interaction of the Japanese with the Germans on this program? Great question.
No. No, that's an excellent question. I did not read about any cooperation between the Japanese and the Germans on human experimentation or with biological or chemical warfare. It could have happened, but none of the research that I read mentioned that at all. Yes?
Were any of the agents ever used on a mass basis?
Well, they were spread throughout the villagers. So, you know, they could theoretically knock out a whole village. All they had to do was either let the rats free or, you know, send an airplane over with bombs or, you know, pass out free food that was infected, so.
Yeah, yes, they did. As a matter of fact, in 2009, we visited Yunnan province and we talked to eyewitnesses and survivors of the dropping of biological weapons.
All China?
In many parts of China, in many provinces of China. And also after the Doolittle raid, when the American tribes were scattered and the Japanese were looking for them, and as part of the punishment for the Chinese people were helping the American Doolittle tribes, so they used chemical and biological weapons in the part of the
To punish the Chinese for having helped the Doolittle,
eastern coast of China.
yes, the Doolittle flights, yes.
Did the Russians know anything about them taking Russian citizens experimenting on them. They were technically neutral. They weren't enemies.
Yes, but you know, they went into if the any Russians that immigrated into Harbin, they were subject to being accused of treason and arrested. So I don't know, you know, whether the Russian government had any input on this or anything, but it was Russian immigrants in China who were subject to these experiments.
Well, there was a Japanese-Russian cooperation pact to cooperate with one another, entered in 1941, I think it was. It wasn't due to expire until 1946. And actually, the Russians violated that pact when they invaded Manchuria, and they couldn't go further.
This gentleman.
Was any use made of the data, the information the Japanese turned over to the Allies?
Well, it was all top secret. You know, it was classified. I don't think the Americans had any access to it.
According to some of these books that you refer to, some of those Japanese scientists and doctors actually came to the United States to work in the Washington, D.C. And some of those weapons were probably used in Vietnam also.
Yes.
Whatever happened to all the research material that the U.S. government obtained, and there have been reports, you discover anything along this line, that things like AIDS and Ebola were actually man-made, synthesized viruses based on bacteriological research that was done during the Cold War.
Yeah, Don, do you know anything about that?
Well, I also read about that, but I really don't have any
proof,
any real information. I read about that also.
All right, we have time for maybe one more question.
Hi, Barbara. Did any of the victims, any of the bodies of the victims being discovered after the war, did they bury any of them in China?
No, the book tells me that all of the victims were cremated. They didn't want any bodies discovered, so that they got rid of all the evidence.
However, when I was on the first tour in Harvard at Unit 731, Curator Kim told me that the underground where you show the picture, there is still a lot of chambers that they haven't dug up, and they're advised not to dig up the chambers. There will be human remains. He told me. When I was walking down, walking on the grass, he said, "Where you're walking, there's still levels of chambers that the Chinese government has been advised by the UN not to take it up because the disease, because they don't know what is underneath there. So there are human remains underneath where we were walking."
Thank you, Barbara.